Hi, I'm Josh, and I'm a white guy who grew up in Orange County, California.
And I'm Jerome, a black guy who grew up in Orange County but moved to Northern California. And we were high school teammates.
30 years later, Jerome and I have reconnected, and while we still consider ourselves friends, our viewpoints differ on a lot of different topics.
But what we don't differ on is that people can still get along and have civil conversations.
Even about serious and emotional topics.
Since I grew up in a white neighborhood, most of my friends were white or other races.
So I said to Jerome, hey, let's do a show about things white people say and prove to people that you can have a civil, engaging, and oftentimes educational discussion.
And most importantly, we both agree that racism isn't political. So we promised each other we would keep politics out of the show.
That's part of our plan to show everyone that these conversations can be positive.
So send us your topics.
And we'll do our best to discuss the things that you hear white guys say. Hey, Jerome, you keep telling me, man, like, hey, dude, like what? Let's do a show just on things white people say. That's the name of the show. And so every time I either hear something or I think of, hey, growing up, when did I hear these things white people say, whether they were quote unquote racist remarks or just not intended to be racist and just like things white people say. And one of the most obvious ones that you and I kind of joked about when I said, well, if we're just going to do straight out things white people say, how about like, okay, how come there's no White History Month or Caucasian History Month? Or how come there's no white congressional caucus like there is? So you've heard these things from your students too, right?
Yeah, definitely. I think that's a great question. It is one that lends to equality in America, where people say if there's going to be one, there should be another. And like you said, I've had students who have attempted to get white student unions through at the school I work at, and it's always denied, and they always come to me asking why.
Well, and I think what's interesting about that, Jerome, is I shared on a couple of our shows that during the kind of the peak of the Black Lives Matter movement in the summer of 2020, and then they had the blackout day on social media where my daughter was trying to lean in to the movement and just say, hey, I support equality, but she has teammates that are Hispanic and Latin. So she used the term all lives matter, and we've beat this one up 3 or 4 times, but this was really before most of America knew all lives matter was not okay unless they were entrenched in the movement. And I kind of feel like there's a parallel here to that, right? Because your students are going, hey, why can't I do a white student union? So address that a little bit, because I'm sure that's a conversation you have with them, right?
Yeah, I think a lot of it lies in our lack of understanding of the historical relevance of these different organizations. So if we start with the kind of premier example of HBCUs, historically Black colleges and universities. And
give a couple examples, name 2 or 3 of the most reputable ones so people can connect.
So you can look at Howard,
Sure.
Spelman. These are universities that were set up to deal with an African-American population looking to be educated, but couldn't find education at traditional white universities that weren't accepting them.
Sure. And Marshall's one of the more well-known one, right? Is Marshall one of those?
No.
No, it's not? Okay. Forget that I said that. I thought it was.
And so, I mean, there's a lot of Fisk University, there's a bunch of them spread all throughout the country, and they were designed to be resources for African Americans who couldn't find traditional education. And so when we think of why they exist, well, they exist because people were denied access to the white universities. And then if someone were to say today, well, now they have access to them, why do those universities still need to exist? Well, because they're universities just like any other university. And actually, there are white people who go to traditionally Black universities, HBCUs, that have white attendance. So they're not segregated to where only Blacks can go to them.
So, you could argue, and again, I'm going to say this eloquently, it'd be a lot easier for you to say it. You could argue there are traditionally white universities because they haven't let a lot of African Americans or other minorities in through the years, right?
Yes, I would say most universities have been historically white colleges and universities. And it's only been in the last, say, 40 years that we've seen the beginning of influx of African Americans into those universities. And still very few of them represent the 15% population that African Americans make up in this country having 15% of their population being African American.
So one of the things we've heard during the election years is the reference to the Black Congressional Caucus. And again, I think white people say, why don't we have a white congressional caucus? Well, give me some examples of some of the topics that a African American congressional caucus might focus on that may not be addressed if there weren't that caucus.
Okay, first, let me be clear. We have a French American caucus. We have a German American caucus. So we have caucuses for different white ethnic groups that exist in America. What we don't know, for the most part, is what part of Africa I come from. Or else I could have a Mali African American caucus. But so the term Black refers to the millions of Black people who exist in this country who don't have a home of origin besides Africa. And so it's been defined as Black, the skin color. Also know that the Black Caucus is not a political organization. There are Republicans, Black Republicans in the Black Caucus, and Black Democrats in the Black Caucus. And so what they're advocating for the Black American in a country that has historically not served the Black American well. And so whether that's education, whether that's social equality, whether that's political equality, it's looking at what Black Americans need in this country and how we find that for them.
So you referenced some of your students, and has this just happened once, or has it happened more than once where students, more than once?
Yeah, more than once, a lot of times.
And so let's dig into that a little bit. I'll come back to my question of, what do they want to accomplish? But where was that coming from? Was it coming from animosity? Was it coming from hatred? Was it coming from, we'll show them? Was it coming from parents who, as you've mentioned, you've had parents kind of stare you down in class and say, what kind of American history are you teaching here? So tell me about, if there were multiple, they're probably different, but tell me about the root of those movements at your school and probably similar to other schools.
I'd say most of it is parent driven. It's parents who say, you should be able to do this. They can't stop you from doing it, so just press the issue. And I think most of it comes from, again, a lack of awareness and understanding of where these organizations come from and why they exist. The Black Caucus was created in 1971. Think about that year. 1971, we're 5 years removed from the Voting Rights Act of 1965 and 6 years removed from the Civil Rights Act of 1964, where essentially, I'm going to bring you back to the term lawfully equal, where we became equal players in this country. But what we realized 5 and 6 years after those laws were passed, the same thing is that things weren't equal and that they still needed to fight. They needed to advocate. They needed to push. They needed to press. So the Black Caucus is created in order to fight for that equality that still didn't exist yet, despite the law being equal.
Well, I'm sure you got pulled into these conversations at your school when there were students attempting to do it because of your role as an African-American history teacher, things like that. But was there any occurrence or point in any of those conversations where you said, hey, whether inappropriate or appropriate, okay, I could see the value of forming this student caucus because it would create I don't want to say a parallel, but an opportunity for open dialogue, an opportunity for education, or was it just too far removed and too emotional to even go down that path?
Well, I think the idea behind it is too emotional in our country. We do have an Italian American student union. We have a German American student union. We have a Jewish American student union. So if the kids want to identify with their cultural and ethnic background, that's great. The white student union in this country has always stood for one thing, a white organization designed for white people, and it's always been about the preservation of white supremacy and white control. I'm just asking you, you can look all through history, and that's what the groups, the white citizens councils of the 1960s, were designed to preserve segregation and preserve their way of life. And so that's the debate that I had with the young men was, what's your purpose? Well, we're trying to preserve white heritage. I said, what does that mean? What's white heritage? Well, being an American. Well, no, it's not. Being an American isn't being white, you know? And so you've got to figure out what the true intention of your mission is. And then we can have a good dialogue about what organization we might create in order to do that.
Okay, you're always challenging me to push you, so I'm going to push you on this because, and honestly, this might be the only example I can think of.
Okay.
A year or so ago, really at the height of the Me Too movement, was the first time you ever heard it's a scary, and I heard this a lot, and this, maybe we can do a separate show because this is a thing white females were saying a lot. Mm-hmm. The white male is under attack right now in America. And under attack, and granted, this is more of a 2019 Me Too movement where you had some really high profile Hollywood types and others, politicians, all over the world, where there was investigations. And I am by no means demeaning any investigation. I give everybody due process saying this person did that or this person did that. But there was some movement and a lot of mention on social media about it's not a great time to be a white male. So if things like that, if somebody actually brought to you, I mean, I know your answer because I know you, but if somebody actually brought to you, hey, we want to have a white student caucus because of things like this, like white male shaming, things like that, would that open up a different conversation? Because I know one of the things I'm going to guess you're going to say is there's other ways to accomplish that. But tell me more about if they actually, wouldn't you be excited if they actually brought it to you in that manner? Like, hey, we want to address this issue as opposed to we want to create this organization that traditionally has just been a racist organization.
Okay, I'm going to be honest with you. White males were under attack. Who was under attack were powerful males. And they tended to be, Bill Cosby wasn't white. And he's the kind of the face of the Me Too movement.
Sure.
Traditionally, white men have been the ones who have been in power and have been in the place to do these behaviors unstopped. And so they've been the biggest culprit of it, but it wasn't a white movement against white men. It was against powerful men. And it just happened to be a lot of white men were in those positions. But I think a better statement you're saying is that white culture has been under attack in the last year. I hear that all the time. It's tough being a white man today. Okay. The truth is, oftentimes, when you've been privileged for so long, equality often looks like oppression. When you've had the advantage for so long, losing that advantage looks like you're being attacked. And that's not necessarily what might be happening. So I'm more than happy having that discussion. That's a wonderful discussion to have. In what ways do you feel disenfranchised? In what ways do you feel under attack? And having that, but forming the white group doesn't help create that discussion. Because in this country, when I say this to you, a white group, what's the first thing that comes to mind in your head? Power or oppression?
Well, actually neither. It was more just racism because of all the reasons you said.
Okay, so that's even further than, I was just going to say power.
Yeah,
you know, and with power,
retention of power in that regard, right?
Yeah, and so I just think that to achieve that, forming a group that historically has been not a good group doesn't benefit anybody involved.
Your co-host Josh Luke here, and if you like what you're hearing, then check out our not-for-profit website at timeforredemption.org. Timeforredemption.org was created so Caucasians and other races have a platform to lean into for the social justice movement. It's not political, guys. It's not even controversial. It's just human. It's a movement that provides resources, tools, whatever you might need for individuals, corporations, and communities that may not be comfortable with existing social justice organizations. So if this sounds good to you guys, check out Time
redemption.org, and just join in and do your part to end systematic and institutionalized racism. Hey, I did it, folks. You can too.
Yeah, I mean, I think these are interesting conversations because it's definitely, we've covered a couple things that we hear Caucasians say a lot in the show. And I think you bring up, I love it. It was a very powerful quote. And I think I've heard you say it before, but this time I wrote it down. When you have been privileged for so long, inequality often looks like oppression. And I think that's a good one really for folks to stew on that haven't just stopped and thought about it. So is there any case, Jerome, where you would see that it would be appropriate for Caucasians? Because look, again, to challenge you, we could turn it around and say, hey, like, why do blacks need an African-American caucus? Because they're either Italian or African or Irish or whatever it is too. You could use that same excuse. I think you've already given some good explanations as to why, but I'm sure you heard that from your students. Well, when you said, hey, you can, if you really want to join a student union, you can go to the Irish one, the Jewish one, the other one. But have they ever turned that around on you and said, well, how's that any different from African-American?
Yeah, which is what the argument back is, which is we don't know our place of origin. Okay. I don't have a specific identity. I don't know whether I'm from Ghana or Mali or, we're at Ethiopia. I don't know my origin. So all I have to identify myself is being black. Most white people in America understand their cultural origin. They know where they came from, what they came from. And so they may be Irish. Being white is not a cultural origin. It's not. There isn't a white culture that is specific to white people.
So why, and again, this is an educational moment for me. Why wouldn't an African-American know their origin? Is it record keeping? What is it?
Yeah. When they brought the slave ships over, no one knows. Okay. No one knows when, some of us might be able to say my family once was in South Carolina because Henry Louis Gates was able to track back our ancestry all the way back through all the money and resources he spends to do it. But for the most part, we're at the, whatever records our own family kept within the guise of them having literacy is what we know. And so, I think that's an important one to be able to say that that's why you see a black student union. And also black student unions were developed in the 1960s and early 70s at a time when blacks were beginning to move into traditionally white colleges. They were the vast minority in environments that were not very inclusive. So they found a way to connect with one another in order to have more strength and comfort and solidarity in what they were hoping to do, and so.
Well, I'm sure learning a lot. Hey, let me ask you about the historically black colleges and universities, the HBCUs, because I actually I was aware of them, but never really actually heard them referred to as that until recent years. Is there a certain percentage of Caucasians that attend those universities?
I'd have to look. It's small.
Yeah.
But I know that there are some. I've known kids who have gone there that were white. And it's really about embracing black culture. So if you're a white guy who's grown up in a predominantly African-American neighborhood, and you feel comfortable, HBCUs don't say, nope, you're white, you got to stay out. I'm not saying it's a 50-50 environment, but it's a place that does not reject people of other cultures.
So we usually wrap up with an action item, and in our last few minutes here, I'll give you my action item, give Jerome a few seconds to think about what he might challenge you to do. If you're ever confronted with this conversation about, hey, why can't we have a white student union or white business persons collaborative or whatever it's going to call it, a white chamber of commerce, really, the action item I would encourage you to do is to use that as an opportunity to educate the individual who says that on some of the things that Jerome mentioned, whether it's heritage or it's, specific to some of the issues the African-American culture is trying to address that are specific to African-Americans. So use that opportunity as an opportunity to educate. You can reflect back on this. You can share that with them, this show, this episode in particular. If they want more examples, we're always up for people promoting our show for us, for sure. So Jerome, what other action items would you suggest for people as it pertains to better understanding why it's considered not appropriate to have a white caucus or a white student union.
I just want to clarify something real quick. So when we think about things like a Black History Month, because you hear that one too all the time. Why?
Yeah, we forgot to mention that one.
And no, so the idea behind that one is, and I'm sure all of you would agree out there, your level of engagement with Black history growing up was very limited. It was very limited to slavery, Rosa Parks, and Dr. King. So the idea behind Black History Month was that you would be able to get a much larger view and look at the history of African Americans in this country who have contributed from 1619 in the building of this country all the way through. They fought in every single major war. Despite being slaves, they took up arms. Despite being segregated, they took up arms and fought for this country. And the idea that we have a month dedicated to a part of society that's been denied for the most part through education. You know, it's not a coincidence that all of the things we're talking about right now all originated in the 1960s and 70s, at a time when the country began to view things a little bit differently. The last thing I wanted to clarify real quick, Josh, was when I said there isn't a white culture, what I mean by that is we shouldn't call it a white culture. What should it be? It's an American culture. We have an American culture. The rich have some of the same things, the middle class, the poor. We do have similarities, but it's not a racial thing that defines that white culture. There are things Italians do differently from Germans, from the Irish when they came over, but those things eventually assimilated into an American culture, but that's shared by middle class Blacks too in a lot of ways. You know, and so I think it's important to emphasize that we have to start seeing it in a different light, in that the Congressional Black Caucus is not an attack on white America. It's trying to better the plight and life of African Americans. And it's really that simple.
Well, and there you have it, folks. So, I mean, I think we've covered it pretty good. So if you have any good conversational opportunities to cover that, I think Jerome's giving you some great examples. Jerome, thanks for the insight. If you haven't checked out Jerome's YouTube channel, check it out. It's called, tell us again what it's called. It's called Time Out for Black History.
Yeah, Time Out for Black History. It's on YouTube.
Jerome Facione Sr. on YouTube. Jerome, thanks again, bud.
Thank you.
Thanks for tuning in to Things White Guys Say. We encourage you to follow our show on YouTube and podcast networks, like the show, and share this episode with a friend.
And visit our website at thingswhiteguysay.com or drop us a line at info@thingswhiteguysay.com.